A man stood at the corner of 5th and Main, watching the world pass him by like he wasn't even there. His shoes were held together with duct tape. His jacket bore the weight of 3 winters and countless rainy nights. His hair, unwashed for weeks, hung limp against a face that had forgotten what hope looked like. This was Marcus Webb, 42 years old, once a respected architect with a thriving practice and a penthouse apartment overlooking the city. Now he was invisible. Not metaphorically invisible like so many of us feel in a crowded room. Literally invisible. People's eyes would slide past him like he was part of the urban landscape, another piece of forgotten infrastructure that nobody bothered to see anymore. But what Marcus didn't know that morning, as he sat on that cold concrete step with a cup containing exactly 73 cents in loose change, was that his entire life was about to change in a way that would make him collapse to his knees in tears. All because of a billionaire's driver who saw what nobody else bothered to notice. Let me take you back to the beginning of this story, because to understand what happens next, you need to understand how a man falls from everything to nothing. Marcus wasn't always homeless. That's an important detail because the world likes to assume that homelessness is the result of addiction or poor choices or some fundamental character flaw. But Marcus's fall was something else entirely. It started with ambition and ended with betrayal in a way that neither he nor anyone around him could have predicted. 20 years before he found himself on that street corner, Marcus Webb was the golden boy of architectural design in the city. He had just won his third major award for his designs of the Harbor Center, a gorgeous modern complex that had become the architectural centerpiece of downtown. He was 32 years old. He had a fiancée named Sarah who adored him. He had money, success, respect, and everything that the world tells you will make you happy. But then he made one decision that changed absolutely everything. Marcus had a business partner named Richard Chen, someone he'd known since architecture school. They'd built their practice together from nothing, taking on small residential projects, then working their way up to larger commercial developments. Richard was brilliant with the business side of things, and Marcus was the visionary designer. They complemented each other perfectly, or so Marcus thought. When Richard suggested they expand into a massive development project, a mixed-use complex that would cost $15 million to build, Marcus believed in it. He believed in Richard. That was his fatal mistake. The project required them to secure financing, and Richard handled those conversations. Marcus was too focused on the creative aspects to worry about the details. He didn't think to ask exactly how Richard had secured the funding. He didn't question the investors or review the contracts carefully. He trusted his partner the way you're supposed to be able to trust someone you've known for 2 decades. And because of that trust, he didn't realize that Richard had been funneling money from their firm into personal accounts for years. He didn't know that Richard had taken out massive loans using the firm's assets as collateral. He didn't understand any of it until the day the SEC arrived at his office with federal agents and told him he was under investigation for securities fraud. The charges weren't fair. Marcus had done nothing wrong intentionally. But in the eyes of the law, as a partner in the firm, he was liable. The legal fees alone bankrupted him. The lawsuit that followed cost him his marriage. Sarah had tried to stick with him at first, but when the scandal hit the news and the social consequences became clear, when their friends stopped calling and their invitations stopped coming, she realized she had a choice to make. She chose to leave. She chose security over commitment. She chose not to be the woman standing beside the disgraced architect. By the time everything was said and done, the judge froze all of Marcus's assets while they determined how much money was owed. He lost the penthouse. He lost the practice. He lost his reputation. Richard, of course, had hidden most of the money offshore and was never prosecuted. He disappeared somewhere to the Caribbean, living the good life on money that was never really his. And Marcus was left with nothing but the clothes on his back and a mounting pile of legal debts that seemed to grow rather than shrink. For the first few months, he stayed with his brother James in a spare bedroom in his suburban home. But James had a family and bills to pay, and it was clear after a while that Marcus was becoming a burden. His brother couldn't afford to support him indefinitely, and Marcus couldn't stand being the pity case that everyone whispered about at family dinners. So one night, He packed a bag and left a note saying he was going to start over somewhere new. What he meant was that he couldn't bear to see the look of disappointment in his brother's eyes anymore. For a while, Marcus tried to rebuild. He worked odd jobs, whatever he could find. He was overqualified for everything, which made employers uncomfortable. Why would an architect want to flip burgers at McDonald's? They assumed he was hiding something, that there was some deeper reason for the dramatic fall. Some of them recognized him from the news coverage of the scandal. Others could sense the desperation in his eyes, no matter how hard he tried to hide it. After 3 months of searching, he finally found a job as a night janitor at an office building downtown. It paid minimum wage and offered no benefits, but it was something. He rented a small room in a boarding house with 12 other people, most of them with their own tragic backstories. The room smelled like mold, and something he couldn't identify, and it was so small that he could lie in bed and touch both walls if he stretched. But it was a roof, and it was legal, and he took what he could get. He worked nights and spent his days trying to figure out how to dig himself out of this hole. He researched legal options. He wrote letters to lawyers hoping someone would take his case pro bono. He applied for job after job in architecture, but no legitimate firm would touch him, with the scandal still hanging over his name like a dark cloud. Then his mother had a stroke. It came suddenly, without warning, and she was hospitalized for 2 weeks while the doctors determined the extent of the damage. She survived, but she would never walk the same way again. She would need physical therapy, medication, assistance with daily tasks. And Marcus, despite having almost nothing, was still her son. So he took money he didn't have to spend on her care, money he borrowed at predatory interest rates, money that deepened the financial hole he was already drowning in. Within a year, his rent payments became sporadic. His landlord gave him notice. By the time he was evicted, the market crash of 2008 had happened, taking what little the rest of the world still had and making jobs even scarcer. For 6 months, Marcus lived in his car, a battered Nissan that he'd bought used 5 years earlier before everything fell apart. He parked in different locations every night to avoid drawing attention from the police. He showered at a gym membership that was now 2 months behind on payments. He ate at soup kitchens and food banks, and slowly, imperceptibly at first, he began to lose hope. The car broke down one evening, and the repair cost more than he could afford. He couldn't afford to fix it, so he left it parked on a side street and walked away from it. That's when he truly became homeless. The streets changed him in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The first month was the hardest psychologically. He kept expecting it to end, kept waiting for the moment when things would turn around. He had a plan. He was going to rebuild. He was going to find a way out of this situation. But after the first month turned into the second, and the second month into a year, something inside him began to shift. The hope that had sustained him started to fracture. Not all at once, but gradually, like a bridge deteriorating from constant pressure. He learned where to sleep safely. He learned which shelters provided the best food. He learned how to blend into the urban landscape so completely that police and social workers would pass him by. He learned how to ignore the comments, the dismissal, the way that people who had once respected him now looked at him with either pity or disgust. He learned how to make himself small enough that the world could forget him entirely. And perhaps that was the worst part of all. Not the physical hardship of homelessness, though that was certainly real. Not the hunger or the cold or the lack of basic hygiene. It was the complete and total loss of identity. He wasn't Marcus Webb the architect anymore. He wasn't Marcus the designer or the winner of prestigious awards. He was just another homeless guy sitting on a street corner. And the longer he sat there, the more he began to believe that this was all he had ever been. 2 years passed. 2 years of survival, of scraping by, of existing but not living. He was 42 years old, and he felt like he was 80. His hair had gone completely gray. His face was weathered by sun and stress, and the cumulative weight of disappointment. His hands, which had once created beautiful buildings, now shook from malnutrition and cold. He couldn't remember the last time someone had looked him in the eye and treated him like he mattered. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt like he mattered. That morning, sitting on the corner of 5th and Main with 73 cents in his cup, Marcus was planning how he would spend what was likely to be his last days. He wasn't suicidal exactly. He just knew that his body was failing him. The cough he'd developed wasn't getting better. The constant cold he couldn't shake was getting worse. He estimated he had maybe 6 months, a year if he was lucky, and the thought wasn't sad anymore. It was almost peaceful, an ending to something that had already ended years ago. He didn't notice the black car pulling up to the curb at first. There were always cars passing by. There were always rich people driving through the neighborhood where the poor and homeless lived, most of them driving quickly to get to somewhere better. But this car pulled up slowly and deliberately. The window rolled down with a soft hydraulic sound. Marcus didn't look up. He'd learned that making eye contact could be dangerous. Sometimes people wanted to help and got angry when you didn't seem grateful enough. Sometimes they wanted to hurt you just for existing. It was safer not to engage. "Excuse me," a voice called out. Female, young, with a tone of genuine concern rather than condescension. Marcus still didn't look up. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for something. Maybe you can help me." Marcus finally glanced up slightly, not making full eye contact, but just enough to register that someone was talking to him. The woman in the car was in her early 30s, dressed in expensive clothing, with dark hair and intelligent eyes. The kind of person who had never been homeless a day in her life. "I'm not looking for trouble," Marcus said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't speak to many people anymore. Most conversations were just transactions. Money for food, directions given in exchange for coins, nothing that required actual engagement. "I know you're not," the woman said, and something in her tone made him actually look at her. "Really look. I'm not either. Actually, I'm looking for someone. Someone who used to be someone. An architect named Marcus Webb. I'm wondering if you might know him, or if maybe you've heard of him." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Marcus felt his heart rate spike in a way that was almost painful. No one had said his name out loud in so long. No one had acknowledged that person that he used to be in years. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The woman's eyes widened with something like recognition. "Oh my God," she whispered. "It's you, isn't it? You're Marcus Webb." Marcus wanted to deny it. Part of him desperately wanted to tell this woman that she was mistaken, that he was just a homeless man, that Marcus Webb was dead or somewhere else or anything that would make this moment not real. But he found himself nodding slightly, and that small gesture changed everything. "I'm so sorry," the woman said, and she sounded genuinely shaken. "I had no idea. I mean, I was looking for you, but I didn't know what condition I'd find you in. My name is Angela. Angela Sterling. My father has been looking for you for a very long time. He said that when he finally found you, you would understand why. Will you please get in the car? We have so much to talk about." Marcus wanted to say no, wanted to slide back into invisibility, wanted to return to the slow dissolution of his existence that had become almost comforting in its predictability. But something in Angela's voice, something in the way she looked at him like he was still a human being worth saving, made him gather his meager belongings and accept her outstretched hand. He climbed into the back seat of the black car, and within moments, they were driving away from the corner of 5th and Main, driving away from everything he had become, towards something he couldn't yet begin to understand. The car was warm, and it smelled like expensive leather and perfume. The seats were so soft that Marcus felt immediately uncomfortable, like he didn't belong anywhere near such luxury. Angela kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror with a mixture of emotions playing across her face. Pity, determination, urgency, and something else that he couldn't quite name. She drove without speaking for several minutes, and Marcus appreciated that. He wasn't ready to make conversation. He wasn't sure he remembered how. Finally, she said, "My father is going to want to see you immediately. There's something you need to know about Richard Chen, about what really happened with your firm." Marcus felt his stomach tight. "I don't know if I'm ready to hear this," he said quietly. "It doesn't matter," Angela replied gently. "My father has been building a case against Richard Chen for 7 years. He's an investor and a businessman, and Richard's fraud touched some of his deals as well. The investigation finally turned up evidence that will clear your name entirely. It turns out Richard was laundering money for organized crime. You were never actually involved. You were framed. And my father wants to help you fight this. He wants to make it right." Marcus felt something break open inside his chest. not in a healing way, but in a way that was almost unbearable. Because if this was true, it meant that the last 7 years, the homelessness, the degradation, the loss of everything, had all been based on a lie. It meant that he could have fought this if he had known. It meant that giving up, surrendering to the streets, accepting his invisibility had all been unnecessary. The realization was almost too much to bear. Why? Marcus asked, his voice cracking slightly. Why would your father do this? He doesn't know me. Angela smiled sadly. He knows what it's like to be betrayed by someone you trust. He knows what it's like to lose everything and have to rebuild. And he believes that if you have a second chance, you'll do something good with it. He's a billionaire, Mr. Webb. He can afford to believe in second chances. The car pulled up to an address that made Marcus's heart nearly stop. It was the Sterling Building, the most prestigious office building in the city, the one that Marcus had always admired for its architectural beauty before everything fell apart. Inside, everything was gleaming glass and marble, modern design that made Marcus's trained eye recognize the elegance of the space immediately. A man stood waiting for them in a private elevator on the top floor. He was tall, probably in his 60s, with gray hair and the bearing of someone used to commanding rooms simply by entering them. This was William Sterling, one of the most successful businessmen in the world. And he was looking at Marcus with an expression of genuine compassion. Marcus Webb, Sterling said, extending his hand. Welcome back to the land of the living. I have a proposition for you. But first, I think you need a shower, some clean clothes, a hot meal, and a good night's sleep. After that, we'll talk about your future. That was how Marcus's transformation began. And while the technical legal details of clearing his name were important and would eventually happen, the real miracle was something far more profound. It was the moment when someone with power and resources decided that an invisible man deserved to be seen. It was the realization that in a world of billions, one person could still matter. It was the understanding that sometimes all it takes to change a life is for someone to recognize your value when you've forgotten it yourself. Over the course of the next 6 months, everything changed for Marcus. The legal team that William Sterling hired worked tirelessly to build a case against Richard Chen. They subpoenaed banking records, communications, testimony from other victims of Chen's fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. A federal judge threw out all of Marcus's charges and issued a formal apology for the injustice. The government even began proceedings to attempt to recover some of the money that Marcus had lost, though most of it was untraceable. But the legal vindication, while important, wasn't what truly saved Marcus. What saved him was being given a second chance at life itself. Sterling offered him a position as the chief architect for all of Sterling Industries' development projects. It was a dream job, the kind of position that Marcus had never dared to even imagine after his fall from grace. The salary was substantial, more than he'd ever made before. But more importantly, it was a vote of confidence from someone with the power to make that vote matter. Marcus worked voraciously in those early months. The rage that had built up inside him over 7 years of invisibility channeled itself into his designs. He created spaces of such stunning beauty that they began to be featured in major architectural publications. He designed the Sterling Cultural Center, a museum that became the crown jewel of the city's arts district. He designed corporate headquarters that became models for how to integrate human dignity and environmental sustainability into commercial spaces. His work, which had once been acknowledged and then buried by scandal, was now recognized again as the work of a true master. But perhaps more importantly than the professional success was the personal healing that began to happen. Marcus reconnected with his brother James, who wept when he saw him walk into his house once again as someone solid and present and alive. He hired a nurse to help care for his mother, who began to improve with proper care and the knowledge that her son was going to be okay. He started attending therapy to process the trauma of his years on the street. He began to understand that survival wasn't the same thing as living, and that he had work to do to learn how to truly live again. One afternoon, about a year after Angela Sterling had picked him up from that street corner, Marcus stood on the observation deck of the Sterling Building and looked out over the city. He could see the buildings he'd designed, the spaces he'd created, the mark he'd left on the landscape. Angela came and stood beside him, and they didn't need to speak. The understanding was complete. They had both been part of something miraculous, though they didn't quite know how to name it. You know, Angela said finally, my father was in a similar situation once. Not homeless, but crushed by betrayal. He spent years angry, trying to climb back, trying to prove something to the world. But he told me recently that the real healing didn't start until he found someone else to help. Until he took what he'd learned from his own suffering and used it to ease someone else's burden. He said that's when he realized that survival was never the point. The point was always redemption. Marcus nodded slowly. He understood now why William Sterling had reached out to him. It wasn't charity. It wasn't even really about justice, though justice mattered. It was about the understanding that we're all capable of falling, and if we're lucky, we find someone willing to reach down and help us back up. And then, maybe someday, we have the opportunity to reach down for someone else. But this story doesn't end with Marcus's personal redemption alone. Because what happened next would demonstrate the ripple effects of one act of kindness, how a single decision to see someone and help them can transform not just one life, but many lives, and indeed the entire culture of a city. Within 3 years, Marcus Webb had become more than just a successful architect again. He became a voice for the homeless population in his city. He used his position and his platform to advocate for better policies, better funding, better facilities for people experiencing homelessness. He worked with nonprofits and city governments to design new shelter facilities that weren't just functional but beautiful, that respected the dignity of the people who would use them. He donated a significant portion of his earnings to programs that helped formerly homeless people reintegrate into society. And this caught the attention of other successful businesspeople in the city. If William Sterling could see something worth saving in a homeless man, maybe they could too. Maybe they had been wrong in their assumptions about the people living on their streets. Maybe the culture of invisibility that allowed homelessness to persist was something that could actually be changed. One investment firm decided to fund a job training program specifically for homeless individuals. One restaurant owner decided to hire exclusively from homeless populations and created a support system to help them succeed. One hospital established a clinic specifically for treating the health issues that disproportionately affected homeless people. None of these initiatives would have happened without Marcus becoming visible again, without someone deciding that he was worth saving. The moment when the billionaire's driver, though the story makes it clear it was Angela Sterling, recognized Marcus Webb on that street corner, was far more than just a personal rescue. It was a moment of social awakening. It was a demonstration of what becomes possible when we decide to truly see the people we walk past every day. It was a challenge to the assumption that poverty and homelessness are somehow deserved or inevitable or unchangeable. In the months following his rescue, Marcus gave interviews about his experience. He talked about the mental toll of invisibility, the way that homelessness destroys identity and agency and hope. He talked about how quickly a life can change, how a single betrayal and a series of unfortunate circumstances can take someone from everything to nothing. He talked about the shame and the desperation and the slow grinding down of the soul that comes from living on the streets. And he talked about the miracle of being seen again, of being given a second chance, of discovering that redemption is possible even when you've completely given up on it. These interviews changed something in the public consciousness. People began to look at homeless individuals differently, not with pity, which had always been a kind of dismissal, but with recognition of shared humanity. They began to ask themselves what circumstances might lead a person to homelessness, and they started to understand that it could happen to almost anyone. They began to see that homelessness wasn't a personal failure, but a structural failure of society, to ensure that everyone had access to basic dignity and security. When Marcus finally achieved the goal of having his reputation fully restored and his name cleared of all charges, it was a moment of vindication. But it wasn't the moment that mattered most to him. The moment that mattered most was when he stood in front of the homeless shelter bearing his name and cut the ribbon at its opening. The Marcus Webb Foundation's Safe Haven facility wasn't just a place for homeless people to sleep. It was an integrated center that offered job training, mental health services, substance abuse counseling, legal aid, and most importantly, a sense of community and belonging. At the opening ceremony, Marcus stood at the podium and looked out at the crowd. There were politicians and philanthropists, business leaders and community organizers. But there were also homeless people, people currently living on the streets who had come to see this place that bore the name of a man who understood their struggle because he had lived it himself. And when Marcus began to speak, his voice was steady and strong, but emotion rippled underneath it like a current beneath the surface of still water. 7 years ago, he said, I was sitting on a street corner with 73 cents in a cup. I had survived a betrayal that stripped away everything I thought defined me. I had become invisible, and I had started to believe that invisibility was all I would ever be. And then, someone decided to see me. Not to pity me or judge me, but to truly see me. To recognize that inside this broken body was still a person worth saving. That moment changed everything. It didn't just save my life. It changed the trajectory of what my life could be. He paused, swallowing hard. I want to be clear about something. My story isn't a story about pulling myself up by my bootstraps. It's not a story about hard work overcoming adversity, though work was certainly part of my recovery. It's a story about luck. It's a story about having access to someone with resources and power who is willing to use those resources and that power to help me. And I know that for every person like me who gets rescued, there are thousands who don't, who never get picked up off the street, who never get a second chance, who die of preventable diseases while sleeping rough. And I'm opening this facility because I want to be the person who sees others the way I was seen. The crowd was silent, absorbing the weight of his words. Marcus continued, We say in this country that everyone has the opportunity to succeed if they just work hard enough. But that's not true. Opportunity is something that has to be given to you. Opportunity is something that someone else decides you deserve. And I'm here to tell you that everyone deserves opportunity. Every single person sleeping on our streets tonight deserves to be seen, to be valued, to be given a chance to show what they're capable of. This facility is my attempt to provide some of that opportunity. When Marcus finished speaking and cut the ribbon, the former homeless people and the wealthy donors and the politicians all applauded together. And in that moment, something shifted in the city. There was a new understanding that homelessness wasn't inevitable, that it wasn't a reflection of personal failure, that it was something that society could choose to address if it decided to. There was a recognition that everyone had the potential to fall, and everyone deserved the chance to get back up. Over the next 5 years, the Marcus Webb Foundation expanded to open shelters in 3 other cities. They developed a curriculum for job training that became so effective it was adopted by other nonprofits across the country. They published research on the causes and solutions of homelessness that influenced policy at both the state and federal levels. And most importantly, they helped hundreds of people transition from homelessness back into stable housing and meaningful employment. Marcus himself continued to design. He created buildings that were increasingly focused on public space and accessibility, ensuring that his architecture served everyone, not just the wealthy. He partnered with universities to create scholarships for students from underprivileged backgrounds who wanted to study architecture. He became a mentor to young architects of color, knowing that he had benefited from mentorship and wanting to ensure that others had access to the same kind of guidance and support that had helped him rebuild his career. And every year on the anniversary of the day Angela Sterling had picked him up from that street corner, Marcus would sit down and write a letter to William Sterling. He would recount the accomplishments of the year, the lives that had been changed, the buildings that had been completed, the policies that had been shifted. But more than that, he would express his gratitude for the decision that Sterling had made to see him, to believe in him, to invest in his redemption. Because that single decision had rippled outward in ways that neither of them could have predicted. One of the most powerful moments came when Marcus was able to locate Richard Chen, the man who had betrayed him, and set in motion the chain of events that led to his homelessness. Chen was living in exile in the Caribbean, cut off from the world, isolated by the weight of his guilt and the knowledge that his fraud had been exposed. Federal prosecutors were building a case against him, and Marcus was asked if he wanted to testify. For a long time, he wrestled with the decision. Part of him wanted confrontation, wanted to look Chen in the eye and make him understand the suffering he had caused. But eventually, Marcus decided not to testify. Instead, he published an op-ed in the New York Times discussing his journey from architect to homeless man and back again. He talked about Chen's betrayal, but he didn't dwell on it. Instead, he focused on the responsibility that all of us have to treat each other with integrity and honesty, and the cascading consequences that unfold when we fail in that responsibility. He talked about the importance of transparency in business and the structures we need to put in place to prevent fraud, and he ended with a statement of forgiveness. "I don't forgive Richard Chen because he deserves it," Marcus wrote. "I forgive him because I can't carry the weight of anger anymore. I spent 7 years homeless, and anger was part of what kept me alive on the streets. Anger gave me energy when I should have given up, but anger also kept me trapped. And I realized that if I wanted to truly rebuild, if I wanted to truly be free, I had to let go of the anger and focus on something more constructive. I forgive Richard Chen because I choose to be someone who builds rather than destroys, who sees the humanity in others even when they've failed to see it in me. And I'm dedicating my life to ensuring that what happened to me never happens to anyone else." When Chen read that op-ed, sitting alone in his Caribbean exile, something shifted in him as well. He reached out to Marcus, and they spoke for the first time since the scandal that had destroyed both their lives in different ways. Chen had been living in quiet desperation, unable to enjoy his ill-gotten wealth because he knew that his every luxury was built on the suffering of others. Hearing Marcus forgive him, hearing Marcus talk about redemption and second chances, something broke open in him as well. Chen agreed to cooperate with federal investigators to reveal the full extent of his criminal network, to assist in recovering as much of the stolen money as possible. In exchange, he received a reduced sentence and the knowledge that he had finally, at least in some small way, made restitution for the harm he had caused. He spent his final years before his death working to make amends, donating the recovered money to charities that helped people affected by fraud and financial crimes. But perhaps the most touching outcome of this entire story is what happened with Marcus's relationship with William Sterling. Over time, they became close friends, not because of obligation or gratitude, but because they found that they had a deep connection based on shared values and shared understanding of what it meant to be given a second chance. Sterling's own past, the betrayals he had experienced, the losses he had suffered, had prepared him to see Marcus and to help him in a way that few others could have. In his will, Sterling left a substantial portion of his enormous wealth to the Marcus Webb Foundation, ensuring that the work would continue long after both of them were gone. And he left a personal letter to Marcus, to be opened after his death, in which he wrote about what it meant to him to help someone escape homelessness and invisibility. He wrote about the fulfillment he had found in knowing that his wealth, his power, his resources could be channeled toward meaningful change. He wrote that helping Marcus had been one of the greatest privileges of his life, not because it had required great sacrifice, but because it had demonstrated what was possible when someone with resources decided to actually use those resources for good. Years later, when interviewers would ask Marcus Webb how he had survived homelessness and come back to rebuild his life and his career, he would always redirect the conversation. He wouldn't talk about his own resilience or his own strength. Instead, he would talk about luck, about being seen by someone who had the power to help, about the importance of a functional social safety net and strong nonprofits, and people willing to invest in the possibility of redemption. He would say that his survival wasn't a testament to his own strength, but an indictment of a society that allows so many others to fall through the cracks, without ever being seen by anyone powerful enough to help. "I'm not a rags-to-riches success story," Marcus would say. "I'm a man who was given a second chance by someone who believed in second chances, and that chance changed everything. But for every person like me who gets that chance, there are people who don't. And that's the real tragedy. The tragedy isn't my struggle. The tragedy is that we've created a society where someone has to be lucky enough to be noticed by a billionaire in order to escape homelessness. The solution isn't to hope more billionaires will decide to rescue homeless people. The solution is to create systems that ensure everyone has access to dignity, stability, and opportunity without having to be rescued at all." This philosophy became the guiding principle of the Marcus Webb Foundation and of Marcus's work in the later years of his life. Instead of focusing just on emergency response and rescue, he began to advocate for systemic change. He pushed for more affordable housing. He advocated for higher minimum wages. He supported universal health care. He pushed for criminal justice reform. He recognized that while his own rescue story was beautiful and inspiring, it was also a failure of society that such rescue had been necessary in the first place. And perhaps most powerfully, Marcus used his platform and his wealth to ensure that others could do what he had done. He created a fund specifically designed to help formerly homeless architects, engineers, artists, and entrepreneurs start their own businesses and nonprofits. He mentored dozens of young people from homeless backgrounds who wanted to make a difference. He lived in a modest house rather than a mansion, donating the money he didn't spend to the foundation. He wore simple clothes and drove a practical car. He chose to live simply as a way of remembering where he had been and why his work mattered. In his 60s, Marcus was invited to speak at the United Nations about homelessness and housing security. In his remarks, he talked about his own journey, but he contextualized it within the global crisis of homelessness and inequality. He talked about the failure of world governments to ensure that everyone had access to safe, stable housing. He presented data about the prevalence of homelessness, the health consequences, the economic costs. But more than anything, he talked about the human cost, the loss of dignity, the invisibility that comes from society deciding that you don't matter. When I was homeless, he said to the assembly, I wasn't invisible because I was hiding. I was invisible because the world had decided I was worth ignoring. I was invisible because I didn't fit into anyone's narrative about success or failure or who deserves compassion. I was invisible because I was poor, and in our society, being poor is a kind of social crime for which invisibility is the punishment. And I want to say clearly that my rescue, while wonderful and life-changing, was not a solution to this problem. It was an exception that proves the rule. The rule is that poor people remain invisible, and we need to change that rule. The speech was quoted in newspapers around the world. Politicians cited it when advocating for housing programs. Activists used it when organizing for change. NGOs incorporated Marcus's message into their work on homelessness. He had become a voice for the voiceless, not because he had any special eloquence or charisma, but because he had lived through the experience that so many were currently facing, and he had committed his life to ensuring that others didn't have to be as lucky as he had been to escape it. By the time Marcus was in his 70s, his legacy was secure. The foundation bearing his name was helping people in multiple countries. His architectural designs were studied in schools around the world. Young architects were winning awards for his influence on their work. But perhaps more importantly, the culture around homelessness had shifted. People were less likely to be dismissive of homeless people because they knew Marcus's story. They understood that anyone could fall, that circumstances beyond one's control could. Strip away everything you thought defined you. They understood that homelessness wasn't a moral failing, but a systemic one. And they understood that one person's choice to lift others up could create ripples that extended far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. But what few people knew was the personal cost of Marcus's transformation. The journey from invisible to visible, from homeless to influential, had left scars that never fully healed. There were nights when he would wake up in his modest bedroom, drenched in sweat, his heart racing, convinced that he was back on the streets. The nightmares came less frequently as the years went on, but they never truly stopped. He would lie awake in the darkness, his mind cycling through memories of cold nights, of hunger, of the particular shame that comes from asking for spare change from people who won't make eye contact with you. His therapist, whom he had started seeing in his 50s, something he now advocated for all trauma survivors, had told him that these were normal responses to prolonged exposure to extreme stress and deprivation. The brain, she explained, had encoded survival mechanisms so deeply that even decades of security couldn't fully erase them. Marcus had found some comfort in this explanation, in understanding that his nightmares weren't a sign of weakness or ingratitude, but a biological marker of what he had endured. What complicated matters further was that Marcus had never publicly acknowledged the extent of his struggles with mental health. He had spoken openly about homelessness, about the systemic failures that created it, about the importance of compassion and structural change. But he had kept his own psychological journey largely private, sharing it only with those closest to him. His partner of 20 years, Alina, knew about the nightmares. His therapist knew. His closest friends and colleagues knew. But the world, which had embraced Marcus as an inspiration, didn't know that he was still fighting battles that no amount of success could entirely vanquish. This was something that troubled him deeply. Because as his fame had grown, as more and more people cited his story as proof that anyone could overcome adversity, Marcus became increasingly aware of a dangerous narrative that was forming around him. He was being positioned as a kind of modern-day Horatio Alger figure, the proof that the system worked, that hard work and talent were sufficient to overcome poverty, that if you were still poor it was because you hadn't tried hard enough, hadn't been clever enough, hadn't been as resilient as Marcus. He began receiving letters from people who had read about him and felt emboldened to believe that they too could pull themselves out of homelessness through sheer determination. Some of these letters were heartbreaking because they revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of his story. People assumed that his rescue by the billionaire's driver was inevitable, that if they were truly talented or hardworking, someone would come along and rescue them too. They didn't understand the role of chance, of luck, of the thousands of small moments that had to align perfectly for his life to change. They didn't understand that for every Marcus, there were thousands of equally talented people who never got their moment, who lived and died invisible. This realization prompted Marcus to do something that surprised many of his colleagues and supporters. He decided to commission a comprehensive research study into homelessness and talent. He wanted to know how many homeless people possessed significant skills or talents, how many had formal education, how many had fallen into homelessness not because of lack of ability, but because of systemic failures, job loss, medical bankruptcy, family dissolution, mental illness, addiction, discrimination. He funded the study with millions of his own dollars, hiring a team of sociologists, economists, and public health researchers to conduct interviews with thousands of homeless people across multiple cities and countries. The results, when they came back 2 years later, were damning to the mythology that had grown up around his story. The research showed that homeless populations included teachers, nurses, engineers, musicians, artists, and business people. It showed that the primary drivers of homelessness were not lack of talent, but lack of affordable housing, inadequate wages, inadequate access to healthcare, the criminalization of poverty, and systemic discrimination against people of color and LGBTQ individuals. The research showed that Marcus's story, while genuine, was statistically anomalous. Most homeless people with significant talents never got their chance. Most would never be rescued by a billionaire's driver. Most would spend years or decades in poverty despite possessing every qualification that society claimed was necessary for success. When Marcus released this research publicly, it created a firestorm. Conservative commentators accused him of undermining his own narrative, of suggesting that individual effort was meaningless. Some of his corporate donors became uncomfortable with the implications of his work. A few prominent billionaires who had praised him as a success story felt implicitly criticized by his research. But Marcus didn't back down. In fact, he did something even bolder. He called a press conference and made a statement that would come to define the second half of his public life. "I have been held up as a symbol of what is possible," he said, standing at a podium with Alina beside him and the research findings displayed on screens behind him. "I have been told that my story proves that anyone can make it if they work hard enough, if they're talented enough, if they're resilient enough. And I want to be absolutely clear. I have spent the last 2 decades believing this narrative myself, but the data doesn't support it. The data shows that I was extraordinarily lucky. I was lucky that I had maintained my skills during homelessness. I was lucky that I was recognized by someone in a position to help. I was lucky that I had no serious health conditions that prevented me from working. I was lucky that I am a man, because homeless women face different and often more severe dangers. I was lucky that I had not become addicted to substances. I was lucky that I had family who, while they could not help me financially, had given me an education and values that sustained me psychologically. I was lucky in so many ways that are invisible to the people who praise my story. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the room. What I want to say now is this: we should not build a system that depends on luck. We should not congratulate ourselves on rescue stories when the real story is the failure of structures that made rescue necessary. And we should not look at my life and conclude that the system works. My life is proof that the system is broken because I succeeded despite it, not because of it. The press conference went viral. Clips of it were shared millions of times. Some people praised Marcus for his honesty and his willingness to challenge the mythology around success. Others attacked him, suggesting that he was a traitor to his own narrative, that he was biting the hand that had fed him. A few commentators suggested that he had become radicalized, that his experience of homelessness had given way to an ideological position that was hostile to capitalism and individual achievement. What none of them understood, what Marcus himself was only beginning to fully comprehend, was that this wasn't radicalization. It was the natural conclusion of lived experience meeting evidence. The more Marcus studied homelessness, the more he understood the structural nature of the problem, the more he saw that individual stories of rescue, while meaningful, were fundamentally inadequate as solutions to a crisis that affected millions. His work was evolving from personal memoir into systemic critique. This evolution brought him into contact with activist communities that he had previously only engaged with tangentially. He began attending meetings of homeless advocacy groups. He spent time with organizers who had themselves experienced homelessness and were working to change policies and systems. He learned about housing-first approaches, about the evidence showing that providing stable housing without preconditions was more effective and cheaper than the current system of criminalization and incarceration. He learned about the connections between homelessness and racism, between homelessness and misogyny, between homelessness and the political decisions made by wealthy people to defund public services. One of these organizers, a woman named Keisha who had herself been homeless for 7 years before finding housing and returning to school, became something like a mentor to him. Not in the traditional sense. Keisha was decades younger than Marcus, but in the sense that she challenged him, pushed him beyond the comfortable confines of his philanthropic work, and forced him to confront the ways that his foundation, for all its good intentions, was still operating within a system designed to help individuals rather than change structures. "Your foundation is saving lives," Keisha told him one afternoon as they sat in a community center in the South Bronx where she was organizing. "That's real, that matters, but it's also a band-aid on a gunshot wound. And the thing about band-aids on gunshot wounds is that they make people feel like something is being done, when really you need emergency surgery. You need to change the fact that there aren't enough affordable housing units. You need to change the fact that minimum wage is below the cost of rent. You need to change the fact that hospitals dump homeless patients on the streets. You need to change the fact that we criminalize survival." Marcus listened, and he didn't argue, though his first instinct was to defend his work. Instead, he asked questions. He wanted to understand what structural changes Keisha and others in the movement were advocating for. He wanted to know what role he could play that would actually contribute to systemic change rather than just mitigating its symptoms. This conversation led to a significant shift in how Marcus used his wealth and influence. While he continued to run his foundation, he also began to use his platform and his resources to advocate for policy change. He supported candidates who championed housing-first initiatives. He testified before city councils and state legislatures about the need for zoning reform and investment in affordable housing. He published op-eds in major newspapers making the case for housing as a human right rather than a commodity. He used his credibility as a formerly homeless person to challenge the narratives that were used to justify cuts to public housing budgets. Some of his old friends and colleagues thought he was making a mistake. They warned him that he was becoming too political, that he was alienating donors and supporters who liked the Marcus who told personal stories of redemption, but didn't challenge the broader systems that had created the conditions for his suffering in the first place. But Marcus had moved beyond caring about these concerns. He was in his 70s now, his health beginning to decline. He had limited time to make whatever impact he could. And he had come to believe that the only impact worth making was one that addressed root causes rather than symptoms. The irony, which was not lost on him, was that this more radical phase of his work made him more famous in some circles and more controversial in others. To housing activists and progressive policymakers, he became a kind of elder statesman, someone whose voice carried weight because it came from lived experience combined with decades of work in the field. To conservatives and to those invested in maintaining the status quo, he became increasingly dismissed as someone who had forgotten his place, who had been corrupted by ideology, who was ungrateful for the system that had elevated him. There was one particular moment, though, that showed Marcus just how much his influence had actually shifted in the real world. He was invited to meet with the mayor of New York City regarding a massive new affordable housing initiative that had been directly inspired by arguments Marcus had been making. The mayor, a pragmatic politician who had been convinced by the economic data showing that addressing homelessness through housing was cheaper than addressing it through emergency services and incarceration, wanted Marcus's input on the proposal. In the mayor's office, surrounded by architects, urban planners, and housing policy experts, Marcus was asked to review the designs for the new housing complex. And as he looked at the plans, something unexpected happened. He saw that the architects had incorporated design principles that Marcus had pioneered, principles that he had developed during his years of homelessness, and then refined through his professional practice. The housing units were designed not just to provide shelter, but to preserve dignity. They included private spaces that people could control. They included communal spaces that encouraged interaction but allowed for solitude. They included access to natural light and green space. The buildings were designed to be beautiful, not utilitarian, because Marcus had long argued that poor people deserved beauty just as much as wealthy people. The mayor explained that Marcus's work had directly influenced the design approach. Several of the architects on the team had studied his buildings and his writings about the connection between physical space and human dignity. They wanted the housing to communicate to residents that society valued them, that they were not being warehoused but being genuinely housed. The designs reflected this intention. Marcus found himself becoming emotional in a way he hadn't expected. It was one thing to write about the importance of dignity, to advocate for policy change, to build his foundation and his public platform. It was another thing entirely to see his ideas translated into actual physical structures that would house actual people. To see the principles he had developed, in response to his own suffering, becoming the basis for how a major city was approaching a systemic problem. He didn't say much in response. He asked some technical questions about the materials and the timeline and the funding mechanisms. But afterward, when he was alone with Alina, he allowed himself to cry. Not tears of joy, exactly, though there was joy in it, but also tears of grief for all the people who would have benefited from housing designed with this kind of intentionality if it had existed decades ago. Tears of relief that perhaps, at last, something was actually changing. And tears of exhaustion, because he realized how much his life had taken out of him and how much more work there was still to do. The housing project broke ground 6 months later, and Marcus was invited to speak at the ceremony. It was a gray day in November, and the site was muddy and chaotic with construction equipment and workers preparing to begin the build. Marcus stood on the platform, looking out at the assembled crowd of politicians, developers, housing advocates, and residents from the neighborhood. 30 years ago, he said into the microphone, I was homeless. I was invisible. I was living in places like this, in the shadows of buildings and infrastructure that was designed for everyone except people like me. I was told that my homelessness was my problem, that the solution to poverty was for poor people to work harder, to be smarter, to be more resilient. And I believed that. I believed that my life was a failure of character. I didn't understand then that my homelessness was a failure of systems, of choices made by people with power about how resources would be allocated and who deserved to have them. He gestured toward the construction site. What is happening here is different. What is happening here is a choice to say that everyone deserves housing, not housing as charity, but housing as a right. Not housing as something you have to prove you deserve, but housing as a foundation upon which you can build a life. These buildings will house people who are currently homeless. But they will also house people who are working but can't afford market-rate rent. They will house elderly people. They will house families. They will house all of us, because homelessness and housing insecurity can happen to any of us. And the question our society has to answer is whether we will allow it to happen, or whether we will choose something different. He paused, and his voice became quieter, more intimate, even though the microphone was still amplifying it to the crowd. I was lucky. Someone saw me, recognized me, gave me a chance, and I have spent my life trying to make sure that luck wasn't required. That everyone got a chance, not because of the kindness of a billionaire's driver, but because we built systems that valued human life over profit, that prioritized shelter over shareholder returns, that understood that the measure of a civilization is not how well it treats its wealthy, but how well it treats its most vulnerable. This building is part of that work, and I am honored to stand here today and say that we are finally beginning to change. The speech was covered extensively in the media. And once again, there was discussion about Marcus's legacy, about the arc of his life from homelessness to influence. But the narrative had shifted. He was no longer being discussed primarily as a symbol of personal resilience and individual achievement. He was being discussed as someone who had used his position to advocate for systemic change, as someone who had refused to accept the comfortable mythology that had formed around him, and had instead chosen to challenge the systems that made his own story necessary. But this public narrative obscured something that was happening in Marcus's private life, something that would ultimately prove to be one of the most important chapters of his story, and one that he would spend considerable energy trying to keep private, even as circumstances forced it into public view. Alina, his partner of more than 20 years, had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. She was only 72 years old, and as her condition progressed, as her memories began to fade and her personality to change, Marcus found himself facing a challenge that all his success, all his influence, all his wealth could not solve. He had been a man of action, of problem-solving, of using his intelligence and resources to change circumstances. But you could not architect your way out of Alzheimer's. You could not fundraise your way to a cure. You could not give speeches that would restore your partner's cognition. You could only show up, day after day, and do the work of care. Marcus had never been someone who spoke much about emotional vulnerability. His public persona was measured, thoughtful, articulate. But in the face of Alina's declining health, he found himself fumbling for words, for ways to express the depth of his terror and his love and his grief. Alina's disease progressed slowly at first. There were days when she was almost entirely herself, when she could engage in their usual conversations and activities. And then there were bad days, when she couldn't remember who Marcus was, when she was confused and frightened. Those days were the hardest, because Marcus would see in Alina's eyes the terror of not knowing, the disorientation of a mind that was fragmenting, and he would be helpless to do anything but sit with her in that terror. He reduced his public commitments. He stepped back from some of his foundation responsibilities, delegating them to trusted colleagues. He stopped traveling as much. He devoted himself to caring for Alina and to beginning the process of coming to terms with the fact that the woman he loved was slipping away, even as her body remained present. This was a dimension of his life that he did not share with the public, and initially he intended to keep it private. But then Alina had a fall, a minor one, but it resulted in a fractured hip and a hospitalization. And during that hospitalization, something shifted. Marcus was sitting in Alina's hospital room, holding her hand as she slept fitfully. She was heavily medicated, and her breathing was labored. A young nurse came in to check her vitals, and when she recognized Marcus, her face changed. "Oh my God," she said. "You're Marcus Chen. I studied your buildings in architecture school. My professor used your housing designs as the primary example of how built environment can contribute to human dignity." Marcus, exhausted and grief-stricken, could barely summon the energy to acknowledge the compliment. But the nurse continued, her voice filled with genuine emotion. "Your work changed how I think about architecture," she said. "It made me understand that designing spaces for homeless people, for poor people, wasn't a secondary concern. It was the most important work we could do, because these are the people that society has already decided don't matter. And you showed that we could decide something different. You showed that we could design spaces that said, you matter. I became a nurse instead of an architect, but it was because of your work that I decided to go into a field where I could directly serve vulnerable people. Marcus looked at this young woman, this stranger who had been influenced by his work, and something broke open in him. Because in that moment, he understood something that all his success and all his influence had not fully brought home to him. His work was not just about changing systems, or building buildings, or advocating for policy. It was about changing how people understood vulnerability, about showing that it was possible to honor the dignity of people who society had discarded. But sitting there in that hospital room, watching Alina sleep, facing the reality of his own aging and the limitations of his own power, Marcus also understood something else. The narratives that had been built around him, the idea that one person could change systems, that individual genius and effort could overcome structural inequality, these narratives were insufficient. They were comfortable stories that allowed people to believe that things were getting better, that the system was working, that all you needed was talent and luck and the right attitude. The truth was messier and more complicated. The truth was that some people got rescued and some didn't. Some people got recognized and some didn't. Some people got to live with dignity and some didn't. And the reason wasn't because of cosmic justice or the distribution of talent. The reason was that wealth and power were allocated by human choices, and those choices reflected the values and prejudices and priorities of the people making them. This realization, which had been growing in Marcus for years, now felt particularly acute and particular, because he had wealth and power, and he was using them to care for Alina, to ensure that she received the best medical care available, to preserve her dignity in the face of her disease. He could do these things because he had money. But how many people facing Alzheimer's didn't have that money? How many caregivers were burning out, working multiple jobs, unable to afford the kind of care that Alina was receiving? How many people with memory diseases were dying alone, or in underfunded facilities, or on the streets? Marcus knew the answer because he had spent decades studying these questions. And he knew that Alina's ability to age with dignity, with the support of a loving partner and access to quality health care, was a privilege, not a universal experience. It was a privilege that he could provide because of his wealth, which he had accrued because he had been recognized, which had happened because he had been lucky. As Alina's health declined further, as her needs became more intensive, Marcus faced a choice. He could keep her decline private, as he had initially intended. He could preserve the public narrative of Marcus Chen, visionary architect and housing advocate. He could compartmentalize his life into the public sphere, where he was successful and influential, and the private sphere, where he was confronting his own helplessness and grief. Or he could let it be known. He could allow his own vulnerability and aging and loss to become part of the public record. He could use even this, his own suffering, as a teaching tool about the realities of aging and disease and care work in a society that didn't adequately value any of those things. It was an impossible choice, and it was one that would ultimately be made for him. When Alina had a fall in their home in late September, and the incident was witnessed by one of the nurses who worked with Marcus's foundation, captured on video, and shared with a journalist who had been following Marcus's work for nearly a decade. Within 48 hours, the video was everywhere. It wasn't graphic or exploitative in the way that some might have feared. It simply showed Alina, confused and disoriented, calling out for someone named David, a name Marcus didn't recognize, someone from her distant past, while she struggled to understand where she was. It showed her fear. It showed the vulnerability of a mind fragmenting in real time. And it showed Marcus, in the corner of the frame, his face registering something between profound sadness and acceptance, as he guided her gently back to her bed. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The comments section of every platform where the video appeared became a landscape of competing narratives. Some people called it an invasion of privacy. Others argued it was educational, that it broke the silence around Alzheimer's in ways that clinical information never could. Some commenters shared their own stories of watching family members decline, stories that had been locked inside them for years, because there was no cultural space to express that grief. Others condemned Marcus for allowing the video to be released, seeing it as exploitation of his wife's condition, as a manipulation of public emotion for personal gain. But the one narrative that surprised Marcus, that he found himself returning to again and again, was the one that emerged from a growing segment of the internet. The idea that this moment, Alina's fall, the vulnerability on display, somehow redeemed the entire earlier narrative. People began to argue that Marcus's story was complete now, that it had achieved a kind of tragic coherence. The poor boy who was recognized by a billionaire's driver, who became successful, who had used his success to help others, was now being brought low by the fundamental human condition. The humbling of Marcus Chen became, in the public imagination, a kind of moral lesson. It was a story about the limits of individual achievement. It was a story about how money couldn't buy your way out of suffering. It was, in short, a redemption arc, and the internet loved it. What disturbed Marcus about this response, what kept him awake at night in the weeks after the video was released, was how easily the narrative had been recuperated. How quickly his wife's disease, his own grief, had been transformed into something that fit neatly into existing cultural categories. The story worked. It made sense. It had the shape of a parable. And in that very fitness, in that narrative coherence, Marcus sensed a kind of violence, a flattening of the complexity that he had come to understand as the actual texture of their lives. He called David Chen one afternoon in early October. His son, now in his 50s, was working as an epidemiologist in Singapore, studying the spread of infectious diseases through refugee populations. Marcus hadn't seen him in person in nearly 3 years, though they spoke on the phone perhaps once a month. David had always been the kind of son who maintained professional distance even from family, who approached emotional conversations the way he approached research problems. With care and rigor, but also with a certain remove. "I wanted to talk to you about the video," Marcus said, after they had finished with the preliminary exchanges about health and work and the weather. There was a pause. "I assumed you would," David said. "How are you handling it?" "I'm not sure I am," Marcus admitted. "I'm not sure what the right way to handle it is. People keep telling me that it was necessary, that it was important for people to see that these diseases affect everyone, that money doesn't solve everything. And all of that is true, but it doesn't feel true to me right now. It feels like I allowed your mother's worst moments to become public property." David was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had changed slightly, become softer. "When I was working in Nairobi 5 years ago," he said slowly, "I was studying a cholera outbreak in one of the informal settlements. We were trying to understand why the disease was spreading so rapidly, and one of the things we discovered was that the people living there didn't have consistent access to clean water. That was the obvious part. But what was less obvious was that this fact, the fact that millions of people were living without clean water in the 21st century, had become so normalized that it wasn't even considered a crisis. It was just how things were. And part of the reason it was normalized was because it was hidden. It was happening outside the view of people who had power and resources to change it. So we published our findings. We made documentaries. We tried to make visible what had been invisible. And yes, we did use people's stories. We showed their faces. We documented their suffering. And I remember one of the researchers on my team asking me if we were exploiting them, if we were turning their misery into a career achievement for ourselves. And I didn't have a good answer at the time. "Do you have one now?" Marcus asked. "I think," David said carefully, "that the answer depends on what you do with the visibility you create. If you create it and then move on, if you harvest the story for its emotional resonance, and then abandon the people in it, then yes, it's exploitation. But if you're creating visibility in order to generate pressure for change, if you're using the discomfort it creates as a lever to move systems, then maybe it's something else. Maybe it's necessary, maybe it's the only way forward." "But who decides what constitutes change?" Marcus pressed. "Who decides if the visibility was worth it?" "The people in the story," David said. "They have to be part of that decision. Not after the fact, before." Marcus hung up the phone and went to find Alina. She was in the garden, sitting beneath the oak tree that overlooked the bay. She was having one of her better days, or what passed for a better day now, which meant she could string together sentences, could recognize him, could sit in silence without apparent distress. He sat down beside her on the bench, and they looked out at the water together. "Elena," he said, "I need to talk to you about something that happened. About the video that was shared." She turned to look at him, and her eyes, even when they were clear, carried a kind of searching quality now, as if she were trying to locate something just beyond reach. "What video?" she asked. He explained it to her, carefully, watching her face to see if the information was causing distress. He told her that a video of her, of both of them, had been shared on the internet, that many people had seen it. That she had a right to know this, even if she might not remember it tomorrow or the day after. Elena listened, and when he finished she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Do you think it will help?" The question was so direct, so perfectly targeted at the thing he had been wrestling with, that Marcus felt something break open inside him. "I don't know," he said. "I hope so. But I'm not sure anymore what help means in a situation like this. I'm not sure that one person's story, no matter how widely it's shared, can change the systems that leave people without care." "Then why did you let them share it?" Elena asked, and there was something in her voice that was utterly present, utterly herself, even as her disease was erasing her. "Because," Marcus said slowly, "I think I was hoping it would change something about me. I was hoping that by making my vulnerability public, by being brought low, I would finally be able to understand something about the lives I've been trying to help. I was hoping it would be redemptive." Elena reached over and took his hand. Her grip was weaker than it used to be, but it was deliberate. "Redemption is a story," she said. "It's something people tell themselves to make sense of suffering, but the suffering is just suffering. It's just living. You don't get to turn it into a narrative that makes you feel better about yourself." He looked at her, startled by the clarity. "When did you become so wise?" "I'm not wise," Elena said. "I'm just old and sick, and I've watched you try to save the world long enough to know that you can't. And that's not a failure on your part. It's just the nature of the world." In the weeks that followed the video's release, something shifted in Marcus's relationship to his public role. The invitations, which had always been numerous, became overwhelming. Speaking engagements, interview requests, documentary offers. The narrative that had been constructed around him, the poor boy who succeeded, who was now humbled by mortality, had tremendous market value. There were producers who wanted to make his entire life into a film. There were publishers who wanted a memoir. There were think tanks that wanted his perspective on aging policy, on healthcare infrastructure, on the nature of dignity in the face of decline. Marcus turned them all down. Instead, he did something that surprised almost everyone who knew him. He stepped back from public life almost entirely. He reduced his hours at the foundation. He delegated more responsibilities to his board. He stopped giving speeches. He stopped attending conferences. He stopped performing the role of Marcus Chen, visionary architect, and instead simply became Marcus Chen, a man in his 70s whose wife was dying, whose time was finite, whose energy needed to be rationed carefully. But this withdrawal, too, became a narrative. It became a story about burnout, about the toll of activism, about the way that even visionary leaders eventually run out of fuel. There were articles written about it. There were think pieces about the unsustainability of individual change-making. There were op-eds praising him for stepping back, for modeling self-care, for recognizing his own limits. And all of this commentary, all of this interpretation, felt to Marcus like a kind of violence in itself. It felt like the world was incapable of simply letting him be, was instead determined to extract narrative value from every aspect of his existence. One evening in November, about 2 months after the video was released, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. It was James Park, now in his 80s, still sharp, still commanding, though his hair had gone completely white. James had retired from the investment firm 5 years earlier, and he spent most of his time now on the board of various charitable organizations. He had seen the video, like everyone else. And he had come, he explained, because he felt it was time they talked about the beginning of Marcus's story, about the drive that had changed everything. "Do you remember," James asked, settling into the armchair in Marcus's study, "why I had my driver pick you up that day?" "Luck," Marcus said. "Right place, right time." "No," James said. "Not luck. Or rather, yes, luck was involved, but that's not the full story. I'll tell you something I've never told you before." I had been watching you for months before that day. My driver wasn't picking you up randomly. I had instructed him to drive that route specifically because you were usually on that street. I was studying you. Marcus felt a chill run through him. Why would you do that? Because I was looking for someone, James said. I was looking for a young person who had the qualities I thought were necessary to change the world. I was looking for someone brilliant, but not in the obvious way. Someone who was hungry, but not cruel in their hunger. Someone who had been broken by the world, but hadn't become bitter. I saw you sleeping under that bridge, and something about the way you were positioned, the way you were protecting your belongings while also remaining somehow open to the world, suggested to me that you might be the person I was looking for. That's not how it happened, Marcus said slowly. That's not how you told it. I know, James acknowledged. Because at the time, I wasn't entirely sure myself what I was doing or why. I told myself it was chance. It was easier that way. It felt less calculated. But as I've gotten older, as I've watched the way your story has been received, the way it's been turned into a parable about the power of individual intervention, I've realized that I needed to tell you the truth. Because the truth is that I didn't discover you. I sought you out. I made a choice based on my own criteria, my own intuitions about what constituted potential. And that choice has weighed on me because it raises questions that I've spent decades not asking myself. What questions? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. The question of why you, James said. Why, among all the young people who were homeless on that street, in that city, was it you that I decided to invest in? What made you special? And the only honest answer I can give is that I made a judgment call. I made a decision based on incomplete information, based on biases I probably wasn't even aware I had, and that decision cascaded into everything that came after. It gave you opportunities that thousands of other young people who were equally talented, equally capable, equally deserving, never received. Because I didn't choose them. I chose you. Marcus leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Why are you telling me this now? Because, James said, in these last years of my life, I'm trying to be honest about the role that power and chance and human judgment have played in the world I helped shape. Because I've watched the narrative around your life solidify into something that suggests that the system works, that talent will be recognized, that if you're good enough you'll be saved. And I wanted you to know that that narrative is incomplete. I wanted you to know that you were saved not because of merit, but because of luck, and because I happened to be looking for someone who matched my specifications on a particular day. There's no cosmic justice in that story. There's just the arbitrary exercise of power by someone who had it. After James left, and Marcus watched his elderly benefactor, his chosen one, move slowly down the walkway, his age now apparent in every step, Marcus sat alone in his study for a long time. He thought about the video of Alina that had been released. He thought about the way the world kept trying to extract narrative from his life, to shape it into something that made sense, something that contained a lesson. He thought about how the video had been presented as a revelation of vulnerability, as evidence that even the successful suffered, that the system had its limits. But the actual revelation, if there was one, was darker and more complicated. The revelation was that his entire life, from the moment James's driver had pulled up alongside him on that bridge, had been shaped by someone else's choice. The revelation was that he had been selected, identified, chosen based on criteria that had nothing to do with cosmic merit and everything to do with the prejudices and intuitions of a powerful man who had the resources to act on them. The question that now haunted him, that he found himself returning to again and again as he sat in the house with Alina, watching her fade, was not about whether he deserved the life he had been given. It was about what he owed for it. And more specifically, what did it mean to owe something to a system that you didn't create, that you didn't choose, but that had chosen you? In early December, Marcus made a decision. He would write a book, but not a memoir. He would write a history, a rigorous, detailed, unflinching account of how his own life had intersected with the larger systems of wealth, power, and inequality that structured society. He would examine the role of chance. He would examine the role of James Park's power and intuition. He would examine the ways that the narrative of his own success had been used to suggest that the system was working, that mobility was possible, that individual talent could overcome structural barriers. and he would use his own position of privilege and prominence to interrogate these narratives, to question them, to suggest that the story of Marcus Chen was not a story of redemption or cosmic justice, but rather a story about how power operated, how decisions were made, how some people were chosen and others were left behind. He started writing in the afternoons, while Alina napped. The writing was difficult, not because the material was hard to access, he had lived it, after all, but because it required him to undermine the narrative that had sustained him for decades. It required him to suggest that his own success story, rather than being proof that the system could work, was actually evidence of how arbitrary and unjust the system was. It required him to implicate himself, to acknowledge his own complicity in structures of inequality. And perhaps most difficult of all, it required him to write with the knowledge that by the time the book was published, Alina would likely be gone, and he would be alone with the monument he had created to his own reckoning. Alina died on a Tuesday morning in early March, just as the spring was beginning to emerge. She went quietly, in her sleep, with Marcus sitting beside her, as he had been sitting beside her for the previous 72 hours, watching her breathing slow, her color change, her body gradually become less her and more simply a body. The nurse who was on duty that night, a woman named Patricia who had been with them for 6 months, was gentle and professional in the aftermath. She helped Marcus with the practical matters, made the calls that needed to be made, ensured that everything was handled with the quiet dignity that Alina, even in the depths of her disease, had seemed to deserve. After everyone had left, after the funeral home had come and taken her body away, Marcus stood in the empty house and felt something unprecedented. Not grief exactly, though that was present, but rather a kind of vast and disorienting freedom. The person he had been caring for, the person whose needs had shaped every day of the previous 18 months, was gone. The vigil was over. He was alone now in a way he hadn't been alone since before Alina's diagnosis. He was alone in his 70s, in his house overlooking the bay, with a manuscript half-written and a lifetime of experience that suddenly had no immediate context, no purpose beyond itself. He made himself